in an impoverished country. He put them in a country that was flowing with milk and honey so they could carry the gospel to the world, both in ancient Israel and in modern Israel. Okay? So, look at Ezekiel 20. I'm on page 27. Ezekiel 20, verses 6 and 15. In that day, in the day that I lift up mine hand unto them to bring them forth of the land of Egypt into the land that I have espoused for them, flowing with milk and honey, which is the glory of all the lands. Okay, he's talking about ancient Palestine there, the land flowing with milk and honey. And what did he call it? The glory of all the lands. Look at verse 20. What happens when, verse 15, what happens when you find something twice? It's established. Okay, verse 15. Yet also I lifted up my hand unto them in the wilderness, that I would not bring them into the land which I had given them, flowing with milk and honey, which is the glory of all the lands. Ezekiel, saying that the glorious land is the land of Palestine. He says it upon the testimony of two. And Daniel twice calls the land of Palestine the glorious land, only when he uses it the second time in verse 41. It's the glorious land that is given to modern Israel after the time period of the cross. Oh, they don't have a problem with saying it was ancient Israel. They're not consistent.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
They're not consistent.
It's not consistent with the map. So that gives you a clue already there's something wrong with it.
When you start, the message we're teaching is true. I know that seems arrogant, but I have to present it that way, okay? The message that we're teaching is true. And all the messages that are against it are false. Okay, I have a reason for saying this. If you get into the spirit of prophecy and you look at what she says about men that oppose the truth, men in Adventism that oppose the truth, there is a characteristic that she often identifies with the men that are opposing the truth. You know what she says it is? They cannot reason from cause to effect. Okay, now that's what you're talking about. You're raising that very issue. You're saying, well, now wait a minute. If all they would do is go back and realize that the glorious land of ancient Israel was a land, then they could reason from cause to effect and see that the glorious land at the end of the world has to be a land. But the fact of the matter is, inspiration has told us that the men that fight against the truth, they do not have the ability to reason from cause to effect. If you think that I'm making that up, type in cause to effect in the spirit of prophecy, and you'll see that that manifests itself with people that fight the truth. So I can't explain. When you start asking questions, why do they come to these conclusions? About, I don't know.
The way you wrote on the board, you just jumped at me. Like, wait a minute, everything, in the Bible with Christ is consistent.
Absolutely. Okay. Argument number 3. Do you realize what I'm doing? I'm just presenting arguments about why the glorious land of verse 41 is the United States of America. The next one is probably the strongest argument. It's maybe the least understood by Adventists, but it's the covenant. How many promises are there in the covenant? See, this is the part Adventists usually are squishy on. How many promises are there in the covenant? There are 3. And you can see the first one, Philippians 2:5. If you will come to the foot of the cross, right now, brothers and sisters, if you will come to the foot of the cross, Christ will give you his mind. You can have the mind of Christ right now. That's a covenant promise. You can have the mind of Christ. You can't have a glorified body till the second coming of Christ, but that's a covenant promise. If you're faithful, when Jesus returns, we get a glorified body. Okay? That's a second covenant promise. There's one other covenant promise, and that's that the Lord would give his people a land. Okay, those are the 3 covenant promises. a land to dwell in. Okay? Now notice where it says all the promises. Never has the Lord been without true representatives on this earth who have made his interest their own. These witnesses for God are numbered among spiritual Israel, and to them will be fulfilled all the covenant promises made by Jehovah to his ancient people. We get all the covenant promises, all of them. We can have the mind of Christ now. If we're faithful, we get a glorified body, but he promised to give his people a land. That's one of the covenant promises. Notice the next quote. Of special value to God's church on earth today, the keepers of his vineyard, are the messages of counsel and admonition given through the prophets who have made plain his eternal purpose in behalf of mankind. In the teachings of the prophets, his love for the lost race and his plan for their salvation are clearly revealed. The story of Israel's call, of their successes and failures, of their restoration to divine favor, of their rejection of the master of the vineyard, and of the carrying out of the plan of the ages by a goodly remnant to whom will be fulfilled all the covenant promises. This has been the theme of God's messengers to his church throughout the centuries that have passed. And today, God's message to his church, to those who are occupying his vineyard as faithful husbandmen, is none other than spoken through the prophets of old. All the covenant promises are promised to us, okay? And that includes that he was going to give them a land to dwell in, a land the Bible calls a land flowing with milk and honey. Notice Exodus 6, verse 8. And you will find reference after reference of the promise of this land in the Old Testament. I'm just putting it in the record. I'm not beating it to death. Verse 8 of Exodus 6. And I will bring you in unto the land concerning that which I did swear to give it to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it to you for a heritage. I am the Lord. He swore it. It's a covenant promise. And all the covenant promises are fulfilled upon Adventism. So the Lord had to give Adventism a glorious land. Where did the Lord raise up the Seventh-day Adventist church? Is it a misrepresentation to say that the United States is a land flowing with milk and honey? You know, years ago we came in contact with a pastor from Ghana. He's a friend of ours. He's still into the message. And do you know what they call the United States in Ghana? The glorious land. That's what they call it, as a slang reference to the United States. Why is that? For all the reasons above. This is the land flowing with milk and honey. Okay, fourth argument, the spirit of prophecy. How does the spirit of prophecy identify the United States? Do you see what I'm doing here? Okay, Daniel uses the glorious land in verse 16 of Daniel 11, and Uriah Smith and the pioneers understood that he was talking about the land of Palestine, not the church of ancient Israel. The word glorious means in the sense of prominence. We receive all the covenant promises, which there are three. We can have the mind of Christ. We can have a glorified body. There's going to be a land given to modern Israel. Fourth argument, spirit of prophecy. Notice what Sister White says in Review and Herald, May 2nd, 1893. Do the prophets agree with each other? They all agree. If they didn't, there would be confusion. Is Sister White a prophet? Okay. The unrivaled mercies and blessings of God have been showered upon our nation. It has been a land of liberty and the what? The glory of the whole earth. Sister White just said the United States is the glorious land, did she not? It's the glory of the whole earth. Do you see it? Am I resting her words? Okay. Next quote. Selected Messages, Book 1, page 92. I'm going to skip over that because these are all references to the land of the United States where Sister White says it's the glorious land. I'm going to drop down to some shorter ones. Drop down to the one that says the greatest light. Okay? America, where the greatest light from heaven has been shining upon the people, can become the place of greatest peril and darkness because the people do not continue to practice the truth and walk in the light. You know why I have that one there? When I first started sharing this message outside the United States, we got invited to England. And when I got to the point of the glorious land, there was this English guy in the back of the meeting, and he got angry. And he was taking me to task. He says, "Oh, you Americans," in his English accent. It says, you Americans, you're identifying the glorious land as the United States because you're from the United States. And I'm saying, no, brother. I'm identifying the United States as the glorious land because that's what the Bible says. And if you think it's something special to say that the United States is the glorious land, then you need to read that quote that we just read. The United States becomes the place of greatest darkness because it's been the place of greatest light. So there isn't any bragging rights that you're from the United States and you're identifying the United States as a glorious land. But the fact of the matter is, inspiration says the greatest light of all time has been bestowed upon the United States. It's the glorious land. No, what did they say? Oh, yeah. There was a time where we had meetings with the pastors and the theologians from the seminary in Germany, and they were taking us to task, and the brother that was translating for us, he was frustrated with them because they were just fighting it. They weren't trying to understand anything. And the translator hadn't heard the message before he started translating, so he's getting convicted. He can see the message is genuine. And he's translating all this through the days to these theologians and pastors. And finally, when they're arguing this point, he says, who was it that was supporting Germany after World War II when it was rebuilt? Who was bringing in the food when we were starving? Who was rebuilding Germany after World War II? And they all went silent because they were fighting that all the countries were the same. And we just let the German translator handle the German theologians, okay? I'd forgot that, but a favored people. The people of the United States have been a favored people, but when they restrict religious liberty, surrender Protestantism, and give countenance to popery, the measure of their guilt will be full, and national apostasy will be registered in the books of heaven. The result of this apostasy will be national ruin. Many were driven across the ocean to America, and here laid the foundation of civil and religious liberty, which have been the bulwark and glory of this country. What makes the United States glorious? The Constitution, separation of church and state. Okay, this is the glorious land. You see it? Okay, that's argument number 4. The spirit of prophecy upholds the identification of the United States as the glorious land. All right, Daniel's distinction. 5th argument. The glorious holy mountain, brothers and sisters. In verse 45 of Daniel 11, the king of the north comes to his end between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. And in the scriptures, the glorious holy mountain is God's church. Go to Isaiah 2. Isaiah 2. Verse 2. Isaiah 2, verse 2 says, and it shall come to pass in the last days. When's Isaiah 2 applied? In the last days. And it shall come to pass in the last days. When Michael stands up in Daniel 12:1, is that the last days? Okay, so verse 45, which is right before Daniel 12:1, where the world is divided between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, obviously verse 45 is the last days. We see the glorious holy mountain in Daniel 11:45, and Isaiah says, and it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, come ye, and let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his path. For out of Zion shall go forth the Lord, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. The glorious holy mountain in the last days is God's church. All right, so what do I mean by Daniel's distinction in your note? If Daniel had wanted us to think that the glorious land in verse 41 was God's church, he wouldn't have said glorious land. He would have said glorious holy mountain. But he didn't. He said glorious land. And in verse 45 he says glorious holy mountain. Did Daniel make a mistake? He's purposely making a distinction. Now, brothers and sisters, you may not realize this. You may not realize this. But in the book of Daniel, the people that are going into darkness over the book of Daniel. Okay? And there's people in Adventism that go into darkness over the book of Daniel. I'm not saying that. I'll show it to you. Go to Isaiah 28.